Hello and welcome. My name is Guy Lipa, and I'm the board chair of Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for our Building Bridges series, which brings together leaders from diverse communities for important conversations about working towards common social justice goals. This evening's discussion about how elected officials can work together to create positive change comes at a time when we are seeing and hearing vile anti-Semitism spewed across our communities. In just the last few weeks, we've seen billboards around our museum vandalized with anti-Semitic messages and leaflets depicting horrific anti-Semitic tropes left on hundreds of cars. We've had a former president overtly stereotype all American Jews, and we've had a celebrity tweet his 30 million followers a desire to commit violence against the entire Jewish people. In Los Angeles, a hate group with arms raised in a Nazi salute hung banners from the 405 freeway saying, "Kanye is right about the Jews." Words matter. What we do at the Holocaust Museum LA is more vital than ever as systemic anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hate is getting further entrenched into our political divide and public discourse. A study by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism revealed that Los Angeles recorded the most hate crimes of any US city this century in 2021 alone. The report also found that anti-Asian hate crime increased by 339% last year compared to the year before, and that Black Americans remained the most targeted group across most cities. The Anti-Defamation League's recent audit revealed 34% increase in anti-Semitic incidents nationwide in 2021, averaging 7 anti-Semitic incidents each day. We must take action and educate, and education is our greatest catalyst for change. Holocaust Museum LA's mission is grounded in teaching students and visitors the critical lessons of the Holocaust and its continued social relevance, empowering them to speak out and stand up against hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. We strive to build a culture rooted in kindness, empathy, and treating people with respect. We are pleased to welcome 3 elected officials representing diverse communities across Southern California for what I'm sure will be a productive discussion on how to work effectively across cultural and political divides to create positive change. My dear friend, Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, represents the 45th Assembly District, which includes much of the West San Fernando Valley. He currently serves on 5 standing committees and serves as the chair of Assembly Committee on Privacy and Consumer Protection, as well as chair of Select Committee on Jobs and Innovation in the San Fernando Valley. He was also elected by his colleagues as chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus. Assemblymember Isaac Bryan represents California's 54th Assembly District, which consists of Baldwin Hills, Cheviot Hills, the Crenshaw District, Century City, Culver City, Ladera Heights, Mar Vista, Palms, Rancho Park, Westwood, and parts of South Los Angeles and Inglewood. He serves on 5 standing committees, including as chair of the Elections Committee. Senator David Min represents Orange County's 37th State Senate District, which includes the cities of Anaheim Hills, Costa Mesa, Huntington Beach, Irvine, Laguna Beach, Laguna Woods, Lake Forest, Newport Beach, Orange, Tustin, and Villa Park. He also serves on 5 standing committees, 5 select committees, and the California Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus. Holocaust Museum LA is the first survivor-founded and oldest Holocaust museum in the country and home to the West Coast's largest collection of Holocaust-era artifacts. Admission is free for all students and youth 17 and under. We bring you programs like this Building Bridges webinar at no charge. If you are enjoying our program, we ask you to consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Government Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. He currently presents a monthly webinar called Dan Schnur Political Report for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan, as always, thank you for helping us create the Building Bridges series and for serving as our moderator today.
Well, Guy, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And thanks especially to our 3 legislators, Jesse Gabriel, Dave Min, and Isaac Bryan for being with us. What I will tell our audience, for those of you who might not follow the state capitol in Sacramento all that closely, I'll tell you that we're extremely fortunate not just to have three of the legislators' most impressive leading lights and next generation of leaders, but three individuals who are especially and particularly committed to working across community boundaries to create solidarity and work toward common goals and common causes. And we couldn't be luckier, we couldn't be any more fortunate, we couldn't be any more grateful to have all three of you with us here today. So thank you very, very much, not just for your time today, but all the tremendous work you've done on behalf of all of our communities, not only since coming to Sacramento, but I know long before being elected to office. Thank you all very much. For those of you who've participated in our programs in the past, you know that we've been holding the monthly Building Bridges conversations for a little bit over 2 years now. We started them in the summer of 2020, just after the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and brought together leaders from the Black, Latino, Asian Pacific, and Jewish communities to talk about how we could work together more effectively, facing common challenges. And even in those early months of the program, I remember talking to my good friend, and if I can cavil for a moment, my former student, Jesse Gabriel, about the tremendous example that our legislative caucuses were setting in Sacramento for these types of collaborative efforts. And one of the things that I've watched the Jewish caucus do over the last few years with the Asian Pacific, the Black and Latino caucuses, is work together, putting aside a lot of the differences that have too often divided us in the past. And not only, as I said a moment ago, to work together for common causes, toward common goals, but to stick up for each other when one of our communities is facing some type of particular threat. It's been really heartening to watch. And Jesse, I'm so glad to have you here with us, because what I'd really like, if you could start us off, tell us a little bit about how the Jewish caucus has been able to establish such strong working relationships with the legislative caucuses that are serving other underrepresented communities in California.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Dan, and it's really good to be with you. As you mentioned, my former professor and mentor, and someone I'm really privileged to call a dear friend, and also with my dear friend Guy, and I'm so proud that he's the board chair at Holocaust Museum LA, and really grateful for the really wonderful work that the museum is doing. And I know our caucus is so proud to have worked with the museum to support your work. And on behalf of our caucus and all Angelinos, thank you for what you're doing. It's also really special for me to be here with Senator Min and Assemblymember Bryan, two people I'm lucky to call friends and colleagues, and two folks who have been amazing friends to the Jewish caucus and also to the Jewish community, and I think have demonstrated incredible leadership, particularly in recent days. So it's really good to be with both of you. I will say, to your point, Dan, really among some of my most powerful experiences in Sacramento so far have been moments of solidarity between the caucuses, when we have had some type of unfortunately, it's often in the wake of some type of incident of racism or bigotry or hatred or violence, where the caucuses have come together to stand with each other. And I will say one of my most powerful memories in my experience in Sacramento was after we had that terrible shooting at the synagogue in Poway, when all of the ethnic caucuses came and stood shoulder to shoulder with the Jewish caucus, really in requesting that the state increase funding for security at vulnerable nonprofits. And it was such a powerful and affirming moment to have these incredible leaders from all of these other communities and all of these other caucuses stand with us. And I think that one of the reasons we've developed some really nice working relationships is not just because what we in the Jewish caucus have done, but because all of the caucuses, I think, are very intentional about wanting to work together, very intentional about wanting to lift each other up, very intentional about finding ways that we can be in partnership and in allyship. And I will say, for us in the Jewish caucus, the way we have thought about this is we really see ourselves as having two main goals. One is to address what we consider to be the most important priorities of the Jewish community. And the second is to uplift vulnerable Californians of all backgrounds. And in doing both of those things, we think about intentionally, how can we partner with the other caucuses? And so that means if this is going to be fighting hate crimes and bigotry, certainly the API community, the LGBTQ community, the Black community, no shortage of experience in confronting issues of racism and bigotry. And so we've worked in partnership with them on hate crimes legislation, on securing funding for community security. These are things that directly benefit our Jewish community and are really important priorities to us, particularly with the uptick in anti-Semitism that Guy mentioned. But we also know are deeply important to folks in other communities here in the state of California. And the other is when we're thinking about serving vulnerable communities of all Californians of all backgrounds. How can we be good partners and good allies? And also beyond that, just being very intentional about it. So, we in the Jewish Caucus made a decision, for example, that we were going to support the efforts to repeal the ban on affirmative action, because we felt that that was consistent with our values and consistent with our mission as a caucus. And so being intentional in that allyship, I think, has served us well. And we've been very grateful recipients of allyship from the other caucuses when there have been issues confronting our community.
Jesse, thank you so much. And I have about 50 follow-up questions already from what you've already offered us. But I want to come back to you in just a couple of minutes, because first I want to bring Assemblymember Isaac Bryan into the conversation. And thank you, Assemblymember Bryan, thank you so much for being with us. I've certainly, before we had a chance to talk earlier this week, have read about your work for quite some time, not just in the legislature, but before going to Sacramento. And I think particularly for members of our various communities who don't hold elective office, I think it'd be particularly valuable for them to understand that it's not that you get elected and go to City Hall or the state capitol or the US Capitol and suddenly take on these type of commitments, but rather these are the types of issues and the types of challenges you'd worked on quite some time before getting elected to office. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those experiences and how you've applied them to your work in the state legislature.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Dan. I'm sorry that I wasn't one of your students. I didn't hear UCLA in the list of universities that you've worked at, but really grateful to be here with you, the museum, Senator Min, and my friend Jesse Gabriel. I grew up in a big family. I have 12 brothers and sisters. I was adopted into a multiracial family. I was born in Texas and moved a lot as a kid. 3 elementary schools, a middle school, 3 high schools. I've been all over the place. And through that journey, I learned to see all people as family in a way. And chosen family is a concept in the Black community, and I think in all communities, but it particularly resonates with me. And so when it became time to start organizing and to start fighting and to start working for the change that I wanted to see in my community, it was always evident to me that people power is strongest when all people are included. And when you walk around our districts and our neighborhoods and our communities, you're going to see Black folks. You're going to see the Latinx community. You're going to see the Jewish community. You're going to see the AAPI community, LGBTQ plus community, renters, homeowners, poor folks, rich folks, highly educated, undereducated, right? You're going to see everybody. And the more work you do to bring people to the table, the better your chances are of improving the conditions of life for everybody. So in all the coalitions that I was a part of, whether it be the Measure J coalition that moved a historic ballot measure here in LA County, or the Justice LA coalition that I sat on, it was always important for us to use that kind of intersectional and inclusive framework. So we would seek out Latinx organizations like La Defensa. We would seek out the youth voices and Youth Justice Coalition. We would seek out AAPI organizations or Jewish organizations like Bend the Arc, so that we could all be fighting for the change that we wanted together. Because one of the things that I've realized in all of my years as an organizer in the community is that we actually all want the same things. We want good schools for our kids. We want clean air and clean water. We want a chance at economic opportunity and mobility. We want to feel safe in our homes. We want to feel safe in our communities. We want green spaces in parks. We want vibrant, livable communities. And that's something that was successful when we were organizing, but I found as a legislator, the same goals remain. And I'm grateful to have so many colleagues now that I can organize and work with in the same way that I used to before I was in office.
Well, thank you very much. And I have quite a few follow-up questions for you also. But Senator Min has been very patient, and I want to make sure to bring him into the conversation, because one of the things we were talking about just before the program started is the remarkable diversity, not just the remarkable diversity of your district, Senator Min, but how rapidly it has changed. And I have to imagine that that creates challenges too. It's one thing for a neighborhood, for a community to change over long periods of time. But in your area of Orange County, that change has happened extremely rapidly. And one of the things I've noticed that's really marked your career in Sacramento to date is these common challenges, bringing communities together in solidarity, has become one of the defining issues for your work in the state legislature. Can you talk to us a little bit about the challenge of a rapidly changing constituency and how you've taken on these challenges while you've been in office?
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate it. And I want to also thank Holocaust Museum LA for all of your amazing work. And at a time when hate is clearly on the march, including in Orange County, which I represent, I think the work of reminding people of their history is so important because, of course, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I appreciate the chance to be on this panel with what I think many would say are the two most handsome members of the assembly, and Jesse Gabriel and Isaac Bryan. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm in the wrong house. I feel like
You and me both,
duck out,
Senator.
but as to your question, of course, Orange County is changing rapidly, and a lot of people still think of Orange County as far as the Orange Curtain, as far as a place where, frankly, a lot of people think of this as an area where there's a lot of stark racial dynamics. And of course, Orange County is where the John Birch Society was started. We have a long history of white nationalism here. And I have the privilege of representing communities like Huntington Beach and Newport Beach. But of course, those communities have been in the news in recent years for bad reasons. The swastikas done with solo cups happened in my district. The murder of Blaise Bernstein by a white nationalist because he was gay and Jewish happened in my district. And so we've seen a lot of hate, frankly, in Orange County. And I like to think that's the old Orange County. And what I preach out here is that is a very loud and vocal minority, but yes, they're a minority. What is often lost here is that we are now at something like 45% non-white and growing. We have a vibrant Jewish community. My kids actually for a while were in after school at the Mirage JCC. We were longtime members there. And right now their elementary school is just across the street from the Mirage JCC. We also have an amazing interfaith community here in the part of Orange County I represent. So you may remember we had the mosque shootings in Christchurch in New Zealand. I was running for this seat at the time. And at that point in time, following those shootings, I remember a mass interfaith gathering at our local mosques, at ICOC, the Irvine Mosque, at the Mission Viejo Mosque. And what was amazing is that we had Jewish people standing guard. We had members of our local temples standing guard to make sure that that they had the security they needed. And it really was an amazing display. We had Christian groups, we had Jewish groups, we had Muslim groups standing together. And of course, what we all know in this room is that the people that are espousing anti-Semitic hate are typically going to be the same people espousing anti-Muslim hate, anti-Black hate, anti-Asian hate, anti-LGBT hate. And so I think what I've tried to reinforce in my short time in the Senate so far has just been the need for us to become allies, to work together, to stand up and denounce this type of hate, to say that it has no place in our communities. And that, yes, that is true of Orange County as well. And I think that's an important message because I think right now, and we see this even in Los Angeles, there are too many people who feel licensed to express in public sentiments that should not ever be seen as acceptable in public, and willing to act on those. And my community sees that with anti-Asian hate, but anti-Black racism is out and it's very loudly proclaimed right now. Anti-Semitism, as we've seen, is being loudly proclaimed right now. And we need first and foremost to make sure that genie is put back in the bottle, that people no longer feel social license, that they feel condemned socially, that they feel the consequences that should accompany any type of hate of that kind. Now, in the longer run, of course, we have education to do. We have outreach to do. We have healing to do. And again, I think the allyships here are important. When we have the Jewish caucus and the LGBT caucus and the Black caucus and the Latino caucus and the Asian caucus standing side by side, condemning hate, but also trying to appropriate resources for education, for bridge building, for outreach, that also sends a powerful message because this is a short-term battle to make sure nobody feels comfortable saying these things. But there's a long-term battle as well of trying to heal and build love so that people don't feel those sentiments in the first place. So we have a lot of work to do. But I will tell you, I wouldn't be in this seat if Orange County was the old Orange County. So we are marching in the right direction. And I just think it's important for us to stand up and unite because when they see us, we clearly are the vast majority. That those of us who condemn hate are the vast majority. But we sometimes can lose sight of that if we're stuck in our own silos.
Boy, and I couldn't agree more, because it's so easy to get stuck in our own silos. If I come under threat, if my community comes under threat, that is the most important thing in the world. And it's really easy to put on those blinders and not see that other people are facing similar challenges. What I'd like to do, though, before we get back to talking about the more collaborative challenges, I would like to talk about some of the unique challenges that each one of our communities has faced, if only so for our audience members who might be looking in one particular direction can get a better understanding of the broader landscape. And Assemblymember Bryan, I have to say, you have taken on, it appears voluntarily, one of the most difficult tasks, I think, in recent California history. And in the aftermath of this very, very difficult controversy that's emerged out of the Los Angeles City Council, which has really divided the city of LA in ways that we haven't seen in many, many years, you have stepped forward as one of the leaders to try to help piece this back together and help us move forward. And I'm wondering if just over the last few weeks, if you can tell us about what that challenge has been like and how you've taken it on to help all of us. And I live in the city of Los Angeles, and I'll admit, I knew, as Senator Min said, we still had a long way to go. I thought we were further along than we were. And if you can talk to us just a little bit about how you've taken on that leadership challenge, I know we'd all benefit greatly from it.
Yeah, I think we all thought we were a little bit further than apparently that we are. You know, when those recordings leaked, I got a call. The first person who sent it to me was my friend Matt Haney. He sent me the LA Times article. I got a call within minutes of getting it, where somebody gave me more information about the other things that were on the tape that were not in that original LA Times article. Within 20 minutes from that, I had the full hour-long recording, and I listened to the whole thing. Within minutes of that, I was talking with Councilmember Mike Bonin, and he and I were in conversations about kind of what he should even do. And when I first started tweeting about it, because that tends to be one of my mediums of advocacy, besides picking up the phone, besides marching, and besides legislating, is trying to effectively communicate. When I first started tweeting about this, there was no political cover. It wasn't a safe thing to do. Nobody had called for resignations yet. It was still the city council president, 2 members of the council, and the head of the Labor Federation. And so it was actually a very unnerving moment, but I was raised in the school of thought of somebody like John Lewis, who once said, you know, if you see something that's not right, that's not fair, that's not just, you have a moral responsibility to do something about it. And in that moment, I felt compelled to do a few things about it and to raise the issue. And I was elated to see that the best of what I believe we all can be and are people who would hear that and be just as outraged as I was. And that's what Los Angeles has said emphatically. And I'm incredibly grateful to live in a city that moves in this kind of deep solidarity. Jesse was an early phone call for me. Members from the ethnic caucuses were early phone calls for me and for others in the city to find out, how can we navigate this together? How do we move forward together? That morning in council chambers, when I spoke to the city council, a lot of people have asked me kind of what went into that thought process. And honestly, it was just impulse. I didn't know Anissis Hernandez was there. Mike Bonin didn't know I was coming. Councilmember Harris Dawson didn't know I was coming. I just woke up and called my chief and told him that I couldn't imagine sitting at home knowing this was happening downtown. And I came into this work as an organizer who often spoke to my city council, police commission, and county board of supervisors. So it was a very comfortable space for me.
And I'm going to interrupt for a second, because I'm going to give you more credit than it's clear that you want to give yourself. For those of you who are not watching this controversy unfold in hour by hour, in minute by minute time, I'm going to remind you that for about a day, most of the political universe was frozen. And most of our elected officials at local and state and federal level waited to see which way the winds were political blowing before they were willing to take a statement on what to do. And Assemblymember Isaac Bryan was one of the very small number of people who did not wait to take temperatures, but who stepped forward right away. And I believe in doing so, gave others the courage and confidence to do the same thing. So
Um,
your credit, sir.
You know, I appreciate that, but I think we all had it in us, and we all were figuring out how to move in our own spaces. And for some folks, it was moving in close, interconnected circles. I know that people on this call, both Senator Min and Assemblymember Gabriel, were in active communication with me and others, ready to act, moving to act. But I was surprised a little bit. I mean, the Speaker of the Assembly didn't call for the resignations until after the President of the United States. So that's how hot of an issue this was in that moment. But everybody stepped up. Before it became safe, we made it safe for each other. And the Diversity Caucus in the legislature, which is a combination of all the ethnic caucuses, the LGBTQ plus caucus, the Women's Caucus, and others, wrote a letter in solidarity in that moment. And I think that's some of the most powerful organizing that you spoke to earlier, that we don't often see except in moments of crisis, right? When a temple or a synagogue is shot up, when a Black man is murdered for 8 minutes on the TV screen, when we see visceral AAPI hate right in front of us, when a nightclub is shot up in another state in the union. And so we've got to continue to work to be in that kind of solidarity all the time. But it is refreshing to know that even in those moments of despair, we can count on each other. And I want to give a particular shout out to Assemblymember Gabriel, because when I got into the legislature, I was kind of looking around to see what solidarity looks like in the assembly. And I noticed on many, many occasions, the things that I would feel compelled to speak on, Jesse would feel that same compulsion, right? For all of the same kind of moral and righteous reasons that moved me on the green carpet. And I know Senator Min is the same on the red carpet. And so to find that kinship and what we believe is right is a powerful thing. And I think that's what all of Los Angeles is tapping into in this moment. I think we're going to come out stronger.
Well, I hope you're right. And hearing you talk, I'm more confident of that happening. Speaking of Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, Jesse, I know you have a family matter that has arisen unexpectedly and that you're going to have to leave before the end of our discussion. And so I'd like to ask you before you have to go, just as we talked to Assemblymember Bryan about this particular challenge, I'd like to ask you if you can address, even in the context of these broader collaborative efforts, can you talk about anti-Semitism? It's certainly nothing new, but the nature of this threat has changed so dramatically in recent years. And I'm wondering if you can talk for a little bit about how you and your colleagues have adjusted your approach to deal with such a rapidly changing landscape.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I'm happy to. I do have to jump in for a minute on the last question, though, if that's okay, and just vouch for Isaac's incredible leadership. And I actually was, he didn't have the benefit of being one of your students, Dan, but he also was a student of Zev Yaroslavsky's at UCLA. And I was talking to Zev, our legendary former county supervisor and city council member, the other day, and we were actually talking about how skillful Isaac's leadership was and how critical it was, and exactly to the point that you made, Dan, that when it was not safe, when it was very unclear how this was all going to work out, that Isaac stood up, and he did that because he, felt compelled that it was the right thing to do. And I think to me that represents sort of a new generation of leadership that the city needs, right? I mean, I think those recordings represent an old way of thinking about communities, about dividing people to create power and to hold on to power. And I think what this city is looking for is a different model of leadership. And I think you've seen that from every corner of the city, from everyone who's been outraged by these conversations. So I just want to also tap my hat to Isaac for just, speaking out so boldly and so courageously and really moving the conversation in the direction that it needed to go. To your point about anti-Semitism, I mean, obviously it is a very, very complicated challenge. And I think for most people in the Jewish community that I talk to, there's a palpable sense that things are different now, even than they were a few years ago. And I think about this on a weekly basis. My younger two kids go to preschool at our synagogue, and they have to go through security. And I have to go through a metal detector to take my kids to preschool. And that was not something that I experienced as a little kid. That was not something that we had at my synagogue even a few years ago. I know friends who have taken their kids out of our preschool, and there's a Presbyterian church down the street which has a wonderful preschool, and they have no security. And so for some people that's a better alternative. And so we are really feeling this threat in a very new and a very tangible way. And it's really sad to me, to go to high holidays and to see multiple security guards standing out front of my synagogue. That was never something I saw as a kid. But we also know that that's what we need to do at this moment in time. So we have thought about this on several levels in the Jewish caucus. One is to try to make sure first and foremost that we're protecting communities, that people are safe. Second is to call out anti-Semitism. We see that irrespective of where it may appear on the political spectrum. We know that we see it both on the far left and on the far right. And even though I'm a Democrat, I feel compelled to call it out when I see it in the Democratic Party just as much as when I see it in the Republican Party. And that's been one of our strategies. Also something I think Dave spoke to very articulately, which is ultimately some of this is about education, right? We don't want to put ourselves in fortresses and behind walls, that we need to educate people. We need to do a better job of using education, because I think that is the most powerful antidote that we have to hate. And a lot of what I have observed is that folks who hate our community, it's because they don't know our community, right? We're a very small community. We forget that. I like to remind folks that there are more Latinos in the state of California than Jews in the world. So let that sink in for a minute. So most people in the state of California have not had meaningful interactions with our community. It's a lot easier to hate folks when you don't know them. A lot easier to hate folks, a lot easier to buy into stereotypes or anti-Semitic tropes when you haven't met or interacted with the Jewish community. And the third thing that we've tried to do to address this is to really ask our non-Jewish allies to speak up. Because it can't just be the Jewish community. In the same way that we felt super compelled to stand, and Dave helped to organize incredible stuff when we were facing this really scary surge in hate against the API community, we as a Jewish caucus felt very compelled to stand with the API community. Because we know in those moments of anti-Semitism that it feels very powerful to have other people who are not part of our community stand up and call it out. And Isaac talked about using Twitter. He had an incredible tweet as the whole world was focusing on everything going down in LA, to basically say a separate Jew, and I also want to acknowledge that there's been a lot of anti-Semitism in our community, and that it's been unchecked. And I can't tell you, Isaac, how many leaders in the Jewish community sent that tweet to me, how many Jewish elected officials sent that tweet to me, and that really meant something to our community, to see people outside of the community recognize what we all see, understand what we all feel, and to stand up for us. And I think ultimately our approach to this has to be, we as a community have to be very vocal about it, but we've got to work with our partners and allies, because ultimately it's about creating a different type of environment that works for everybody.
And Jesse, I know that you are about to need to go, but I'm going to beg your indulgence to keep you for just one more minute, because I think there's a particularly important question. Because as I think Guy and I have told you in the past, and as you know, that while our audience is not completely Jewish, over the years of building bridges, we have been very proud that we do get a more diverse audience. But most of our participants, most of our audience members are from the Jewish community. Given that you've talked about the example that you and your fellow members of the caucus have set for the rest of us, before you go, what advice would you give to those of us in the community? What can and should the Jewish community and all of our communities be doing that we're not doing right now to help move these efforts forward?
Well, I think I honestly, Dan, I want to compliment you and Guy, because I think you are setting the example here, which is look for opportunities to engage in meaningful ways with other communities, right? And I think one of the things we talk about is living in our silos. I discovered very early in my time in the legislature that not every community in the state of California looks like Encino, where I live, right? I mean, we have a very robust and thriving Jewish community, but there's a lot of folks from other communities that may not know us, and frankly, we don't know them. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do is to intentionally and actively seek out other communities. And the first thing we can do before talking to them about anti-Semitism and the concerns we have is to try to listen and to try to understand what are the concerns of those communities. How can we be good allies to them? A lot of what we have tried to do in our work in the caucus is be allies to other communities with no strings attached, right? We're going to stand up for you. There's nothing that we expect in return. We just know that it's important for us to be in solidarity with you in this moment, because that's something that's important, because we believe in what you're trying to do, and it's important for the future of the state.
And I think it's such a critically important lesson, which is if we wait for someone else to do it, it's probably not going to happen. And taking that first proactive step can often feel uncomfortable, but it's the right thing to do. Please.
I was just going to say, I just wanted to say thank you again, Dan, because I think these kind of conversations, these kind of exchanges, bringing folks together, it's one of the blessings and privileges of serving in the legislature, is being able to act with so many diverse folks, right? And California is even more diverse, I think, than I fully appreciated before I was elected. And you see the whole mosaic of these communities from across the state. And what you learn as you interact with leaders from all these communities, there's so much that we have in common. Right. And I think Isaac spoke beautifully to this about we want the same stuff. We want, good schools for our kids and clean air and, communities where people can thrive. And I think we as a Jewish community, we have an obligation to reach out and get to know these other communities and think about how we can work with them.
Jesse, listen, as I said a few minutes ago, we understand that you have a family obligation. Please let Rachel and your parents and your entire family know that our thoughts are with you. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate you all. Really an honor to be here. Thank you.
Okay. So Senator Dave Min, you've been very patient. I do want to bring you back into this conversation because I think both Assembly members Bryan and Gabriel have talked about particular challenges that their own communities have faced. One of the great privileges that I have here in Los Angeles is I've been honored to serve as a board member for an organization called CAUSE, Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment, a young Asian Pacific leadership organization. And it's because of my involvement in CAUSE that I got a much better sense than I probably would have otherwise about the challenges that the API community has faced, and faced particularly in the first months of the COVID pandemic. And we've talked earlier about how communities come together to take on common challenges. But both Assemblymember Bryan and Assemblymember Gabriel have talked about challenges, particularly their community. I'm wondering if you can help our audience understand what the Asian Pacific community was facing during that very difficult time.
Thank you, Dan. And first, I just want to echo the comments and incorporate the comments of Assemblyman Bryan and Assemblyman Gabriel into my own thoughts, because I think they spoke very eloquently on themes that the API community is starting to relearn. So I'm a Korean American. I'm actually only the second Korean American ever to serve in the state Senate. The first was a guy named Alfred Song, who left office in 1978. So it was nearly 40 years between Korean American senators. We've long had a lack of representation, and right now I'm one of only 2 Asian American or Pacific Islander senators in the California State Senate. And so with that, I've kind of had to take on the role not only of representing my part of Orange County, but really Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders across the state, across Southern California, certainly. And of course, we've seen a resurgence in anti-Asian hate. And as a Korean American, I'll just say that, we recently celebrated the 40th anniversary of Saigu, which is the LA riots, which took place on 4/29, which is what Saigu means, April 29th. And I think at that point in time, the Korean American community kind of learned a lot of lessons about the importance of engaging with other communities, in particular the Black communities that they were adjacent to. And I think up till that time, I think Korean Americans had kind of thought if we can just keep our heads down and avoid politics, that's our route to achieving the American dream. And certainly, I think any Asian American will tell you that we feel like we experience a lot of different types of discrimination. But what cuts into that, of course, is the model minority myth that Asian Americans are all people like me, frankly, who went to Ivy League schools and have overperformed. And the reality is that many Asian Americans have struggled, and we do face discrimination. But and in the past, we faced pretty stark discrimination. But I think what the last couple of years have taught us, really since the onset of COVID and the scapegoating of Chinese and other Asian communities for COVID, that while we're used to a lot of discrimination, I don't think we'd faced we'd not been in the spotlight in this way. We'd not faced the regular acts of hate that so many Asian Americans now face. We didn't worry, and I know that other communities experience this on a regular basis, but we didn't worry about going to the grocery store or being attacked in our places of work or being spit on or called racist insults in public. And so, we hear story after story about this. And some of these actions, as we know, are criminal, and those are the ones that typically go viral or make the news. The assaults on elderly Chinese people in San Francisco, on Asian women in New York or LA. But a lot of them are not criminal. They're just acts that make Asians fearful of being in public, of going to their places of work, their places of worship, into their homes. And it's just being stalked by somebody who comes after you and spews racist insults, calls you a chink, calls you exotic if you're a woman, kind of harasses you. And if you ignore them, starts to get very aggressive with rhetoric. And these are the types of things that, again, get reported on a regular basis. So echoing the themes of what was said before, I think what we've had to do is intentionally try to create those allyships. And I think that's been a very important lesson that the Asian American Pacific Islander communities had to relearn, that we can't exist in a silo, that what affects other communities also affects us, because we know that people who are full of hate in one regard typically going to have all the other racist and anti-LGBT, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim tropes in their hearts and minds as well. So I think, and frankly, I'll be honest, a lot of Asian Americans were content to be siloed. They did keep their heads down as we saw, a resurgence in hate against other communities. And I often, would be the only Asian American in earlier years where when we saw attacks on mosques, on temples, at the temple shooting, we didn't see a lot of Asian faces out there, unfortunately. And I think my communities are starting to relearn that lesson, that we need to be present, that we need to stand with people that are naturally allied with us if we want them to stand with us. And so, again, want to extend my thank you to the leadership of Assemblyman Bryan, all the amazing people, Assemblyman Gabriel, all the amazing people in the legislature that have time and time again stood with our community as API hate has been on the rise. And I do think that's important. And so my role in the state Senate, I've attended in person or on Zoom over 140 events right now related to anti-Asian hate. I did not think I was going to spend this much time on this issue, but of course, as one of two Asian American senators, if I'm not doing it, I can't expect Isaac Bryan to show up. I can't expect Jesse Gabriel to show up. I've got to stand there first. And then I think, again, the flip side of this, and I hope my communities remember this, is that we need to stand with them. When we see anti-Black hatred, when we see anti-Semitism right now, we need to be at the forefront of this, condemning Kanye West, condemning the people on the 405, condemning all of those folks who are willing to go out and publicly, act in ways that are clearly anti-Semitic. So again, we've got a lot of work to do as far as what we see on anti-Asian hate. We know it's on the rise, and the statistics are very, very startling. And I'll say that California is one of the central places where we see that rise in anti-Asian hate, and it's coming from all quarters. It's coming from white people, from brown people, from Black people. It's coming in all forms, and that's something that we've continued to try to address in the legislature, but also through modeling behavior, by standing out and denouncing this, by standing with our allies in various ways.
Well, Senator, several really important points there. One that really stuck out to me, and I think it will for many members of our audience also, because this is one of I think a number of parallels between our communities. And you said just in passing, a lot of members of our community are okay siloing, and I think we go through the same kind of challenge in the Jewish community. When I'm at a cause event and I have an opportunity to speak to a group of young Asian Pacific leaders, invariably one of them will ask me very respectfully, they'll say, "What are you doing here?" And I'll say, "Look, we were the model minority right before you were, and we probably didn't handle it as well as we should have. And so if we can figure this out together, think of how much more we can accomplish." So I guess the follow-up question I have for you, and then I want to ask a very similar question to Assemblymember Bryan, is how do you go to members of your own community and say, "Yes, I understand we're facing extraordinary challenges of our own. I know that you have some concerns and sometimes some suspicions towards other communities where you might not know a lot of other people.
Yeah.
But you need to make this outreach anyway." How do you have that conversation within the API community?
That's a great question, Dan. And first of all, thank you for standing with our communities and for your involvement with Cause and so many other great causes. There is obviously a challenge within, and I think this is parallels to your point, some of what we're seeing in the Jewish community, where we have people that are intentionally stirring racism as the antidote to anti-Asian hate. We have people out there. I will tell you right now, even though the statistics are clear that the vast majority of anti-Asian hate is not from other minorities, but from white people, since they are the majority of the population, I have run into people, Chinese Americans who get their news from like WeChat and social media, that believe that 100% of anti-Asian hate attacks are from African Americans. Why? Because every time there is a Black on Asian attack, it goes viral, and certain quarters will promote that heavily. And we have this narrative. It's the same people that run Chinese Americans against affirmative action. It's the same people that are trying to stoke hate and division within our communities. And that's a real problem we're facing right now in a lot of different API communities. We often talk in the API community about how we need to be more proactive in trying to address some of these very intentional efforts to try to divide rather than unite us from our natural allies. So obviously just being present all the time in our different communities is important. So, I have an incredibly diverse district as far as APIs. We have Indians, Pakistanis, Koreans, Vietnamese, Chinese, Hmong, Filipinos, and we make an intentional effort to try to engage with all the leading community activists, to try to engage with them on hate and other issues. And then I think just being out there at events like this. And so I want to thank you for putting this together, because the more we are seeing publicly engaging with other communities, talking about hate, talking about our shared experiences and the need to unite, I'm hopeful that that message will start to resonate downstream. Because right now, I think we do a tremendous job in the legislature of uniting, but I don't always see that same unity in our communities. And that's something, I don't pretend to have the secret sauce here, but I just believe that modeling that behavior, getting that message out there and continually reinforcing that is really, really important. So I look forward to hopefully continuing to work with you on behalf of my caucus and Asian Americans, with Isaac, who's been an ally, with Jesse, with Scott Wiener from the LGBT caucus, with the Latino caucus, and so many others, because again, we just have to keep pounding that message.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. There's a wonderful saying, specificity is the opposite of prejudice. That when you get to know someone, it becomes a lot harder to hold a stereotype that you may have formed. But some of you remember Bryan, and both Jesse Gabriel and Dave Min have talked about this also. You all have a very unique opportunity in the legislature to work side by side and elbow to elbow with people from a whole range of backgrounds and heritages and perspectives. And not every member of all of our communities have that opportunity. So how do you approach this within your own African-American community? How do you say, I know you have some natural suspicions. I know you might have some good reason for those suspicions, but it's important that we do this anyway. How do you do that?
I think first and foremost, and Senator Min is doing a phenomenal job of this. So Senator Gabriel, you lead by example, right? You show what that solidarity can and should look like at its absolute best. And I think also you drown out the false narratives, like Senator Min mentioned, right? There are a lot of people who have a vested interest in the conflict between communities. And the people who have the deepest interest in that conflict are the same people who have the deepest interest in stoking hate, right? And promoting violence. And so you've got to combat that with love and communication and compassion and solidarity. And we've also got to do an even better job of not just showing up in a time of clear and obvious crisis, right? We've got to be there in times of joy, right? I need to be there celebrating high holidays. You all need to get down to Lamert Park for Juneteenth. Like we need to build together as communities. We need to go past the orange curtain and see Senator Min. We need to be there for each other in times of joy as well, and in times of policymaking, right? Sometimes policymaking has done damage in our communities that isn't always obvious, but the impact has produced outcomes that are disparate throughout different parts of our state. And seeing that solidarity in those moments, I know in the Black community, is one of the strongest signs of solidarity. When you're willing to question the size of the criminal legal system, or how almost 40% of the people on the streets come from the Black community when only 8% of the county population is Black. When you're willing to have those conversations and delve into the policies that create that, those are the biggest signals you can have for another community. And that's what I try to model in my solidarity with the various communities in the legislature. I'm there for the Jewish community, fighting for security grants. I'm there for the AAPI community, fighting to secure budget dollars against Asian hate. I'm there with the LGBTQ community, fighting to make it easier for families to adopt children. We've got to show up in those ways as well. And that's something uniquely legislators can do. But when people see us doing that, the stuff we can do in the community is actually even easier, because that's just physically showing up. That's going to the places that you may not have thought you were comfortable before. But once you make your presence known, it becomes the most comfortable space you could be in, because you find out just how much we all have in common. I'll never forget the first Hanukkah event I went to when I got into office. And I looked around and I was the only Black person at the event. And Jesse walked up to me and, just gave me a big old hug and was grateful that I was there. And it started a conversation between he and I that ultimately led to a trip to Israel. Right. And it's that kind of finding your place and belonging in spaces that you didn't think belonged to you is when you realize we all belong with each other.
I couldn't agree with you more. I had the same experience that you did at your first Hanukkah in reverse. When I first moved to LA 30 some years ago, I went to an event to which I was invited in Inglewood. And I was not just the only Jewish person there, but I was the only white person there. And I remember that feeling of discomfort, saying, did I make a mistake by coming? Was this the wrong thing to do? And all it took was one extraordinary young person who came up to me and said, I'm so glad you're here, which made me realize it was the right step to take. So I completely understand your point. We're actually running low on time. And so if anybody else does have questions, I've monopolized this conversation all the way through. Just as a reminder, you can post questions in the Q&A, and I'll certainly be happy to pass them on to either Assemblymember Bryan or Senator Min. But while we're waiting for them, or in our remaining time, I have one last question for each of the two of you. And Assemblymember Bryan, I'll start with you. You began to talk about this a moment ago, but I'd like you to take it a bit further. What are our biggest challenges going forward? We've had this conversation, we have this awareness, you've given us excellent advice, but what should we be aware of about the obstacles and challenges in our path going forward?
And we've got to recognize that there are going to be individual and isolated incidents of conflict between communities, right? There is going to be a Black person who commits violence against someone in the AAPI community. There is going to be something that is anti-Black and racist said by a member of the Jewish community or the Latinx community or the AAPI community. There is going to be homophobic slur said by somebody who is heterosexual. And what we can't do is hold entire communities accountable for those kinds of incidents. That's when we've got to dig deep with our allies. That's why when we've got to build our strongest solidarity, and we've got to root that kind of hate out. We've got to hold it accountable. And then we've got to commit to continuing to build together. And I was honestly, Dave, you kind of touched me in the way that you spoke about how you step into those meetings, all 148 of them, and try to paint a bigger picture and move beyond individual incidents and talk about the kind of solidarity work that we all have in common. And I'm grateful for your leadership. And I think that's the kind of thing that is a challenge going forward, but where real leaders emerge and where the best of our days are ahead of us.
Well, once again, I think just such an important point that all the outreach, all the joint efforts in the world don't eliminate hate. They might make it more challenging. They don't eliminate it. And I think you've made it really given us a really important reminder that no matter how hard we work, these things are going to happen. And we can't use them excuses to step back. We need to use them as incentives to step forward. I couldn't agree with you more. Senator Min, same question to you. Knowing what our path is going forward, having heard from you and your colleagues over the last hour, what else should we be aware of? What should be the challenges and the obstacles for which we're prepared?
I think this builds on Bryan's point. There are things that are going to pop up here and there, but I think the biggest challenge going forward that I see is a challenge we see within the API coalition, which is the API coalition is an incredibly diverse diaspora, right? We were talking the difference between someone from Iran who immigrated in the last 10 years is very different than mainland China, who immigrated 20 years ago, is different than Taiwanese Chinese that immigrated like 50 years ago, is different than, Indian, et cetera, et cetera. Asian Americans represent 2/3 of the world's population. And we're talking about trying to find a unified pathway here. And even when we're talking about hate, look, there's different instances of hate. After 9/11, it was typically South Asians, particularly those who are Sikhs or Muslims, who face the most discrimination. Now it is East Asians who are facing the most discrimination. We have trouble uniting within our own coalition, and then let alone finding common cause with Black and Brown and Jewish and Muslim people. This is a challenge that we face, and it's easy to focus on the differences between us. And I think what we have to focus on is the similarities, what unites us, our common values, our common experiences, our common challenges. And I will tell you, even though I grew up in a very different environment than Isaac Bryan, and I, obviously I'm a very different ethnicity than Isaac Bryan, we have much, much, much more in common than what divides us, than what's different about us. And I think there are those that will try to use our differences to divide us, that will try to drive wedges in. And we see intentional efforts, unfortunately, right now, from lots of politicians out there to try to divide us. And it is more challenging to try to unite us based on our commonalities. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge I see going forward is how do we stick with a message of positivity, of unity, when there are real differences between our communities, and there are those that are intentionally trying to drive wedges into those differences. So I think we just have to stay hyper vigilant. We have to encourage that presence that you all are talking about. I spend more time, by the way, in churches and temples and mosques that are not my own church. I think my own church and priests there are getting a little jealous, but I come back every 2 months, 3 months, and I go to the AME, I go to the mosques, I go to the temples. But I think that's important because we have, as elected leaders, have to display through example what we want to model for our constituents. And I hope that we can encourage more of that among people in our community, because that's going to be critical to building those bridges. As you said, specificity is important.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Senator Dave Min. Thank you, Assemblymember Isaac Bryan. Thanks in absentia to our good friend and ally, Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, for giving us your time and sharing your extremely valuable insights and advice on how we can help be part of the solution going forward. And I want to thank all of you for watching tonight online, for joining us for this very inspiring conversation. For those of you who've been with us online for the last couple of years, I have some exciting news. We're actually going to begin our in-person programming again in November, right after Thanksgiving. And the coalition that we put together way back in those early days, Michael Lawson, the CEO of the Los Angeles Urban League, Charlie Wu, the president of the Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment, and Helen Tautas, the president and executive director of HOPE, Hispanos Organized for Political Equality, will be with us in person at the museum, along with Jewish community leaders as well, to take this conversation forward. We'll be sending out more information on the specifics of that, but I hope that for all of you who've joined us online, you'll come and see us in person. And if you're not able to make it that night, as always, we'd love to have you at the museum. For me, it's been an incredibly moving experience every time I visited. Senator Min, Assemblymember Bryan, we would love to have you and other representatives from your community with us whenever your very, very busy schedules allow. So hopefully we can follow up with you on that one. But once again, thanks to both of you. Thanks to all of you. And again, for our audience, please also follow up on mouthful here. Please follow up on HolocaustMuseumLA.org. HolocaustMuseumLA, all one word, .org, for our full calendar of upcoming in-person and online programs, including our weekly Holocaust survivor talks. Dave Min, Isaac Bryan, thank you so much, not just for being with us tonight, but for all the good you do all day, every day, for us and for the people of California. Thanks, everyone else. Have a great night. We'll see you again in late November.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Isaac, great to see you.
Good to see you too, Senator.
Thanks for your leadership in LA. Really appreciate that.
Definitely.